Katie and I, as we already had mentioned, are both serving on the research committee of the AFA. How many of you guys have heard the complaints about our lack of professional standing within the industry? Everybody's heard it, everybody's annoyed with it. We look for lots of different ways that we can gain professional standing within the industry. And what we want to try to demonstrate tonight is that research is probably one of the #1 ways that we can gain that standing within the industry. And it's not difficult. It sounds scary. We all worry about it. I did too. Katie had to travel down to Iowa State and actually give me a weekend crash course in understanding research. But it's something that we can do to move ourselves ahead within the industry without saying the word license or without saying a lot of the other things everybody's just scared to mention. So bear with us as we go through this. We need to skip slides. Katie's kind of really in charge of me, and sometimes she misses. She usually has a clicker. She clicks the clicker and I get a treat, and then I know when I'm supposed to talk about the next slide, so she missed it through there. Just real quickly, what's going on within the research committee? A lot of you aren't aware that we've got some money put away. There's $37,500 roughly in the research fund right now. We're going to be investing that in a real research fund. So it's no longer going to be collecting the 2 or 3% in a checking account, but it's actually going to be invested. And the goal with these research funds is that they eventually are self-sustaining so that we can release grants in the amount of maybe $10,000, $12,000, $20,000 a year as we get down the road. But there's a seed money that stays in that research fund that fuels the research that's going out, so we're not actually dipping into it. That's the near future here. We have severed our associations with the Morris Animal Foundation. I think it was a really good idea at first, and it worked fairly well for us as we developed this. The problem that we had as a committee with the Morris Animal Foundation is that there were no foot-related research coming out of the foundation that we could fund. So we want to see peer-reviewed, real foot research coming out, and we would like to come out of the AFA. So that was the reason for severing ties with the Morris Animal Foundation. I've already introduced the two of us. Our other member, James Demoni's in Colorado. He's currently a vet student. He's been very helpful, kind of from a remote location. Neither Katie or I have actually met him, but he's been helpful.
So what we decided to do in place of giving grants out to Morris Animal Foundation is develop a system where farriers can have the tools to be able to carry out the research ourselves. And a point that I'll bring up multiple times is I'm sure that almost everyone here has had a good idea and said somebody will do that or somebody should carry that out. And my point to you guys today is that you are that somebody. A vet or a researcher isn't going to care or have the same passion or the same context to use the information that you guys do. So we are that somebody. So in that regard, we had to come up with a 2-part grant system because I need to give you the tools to be able to carry out the research. I can't just tell you, have at it, because you haven't had the benefit of the training that I've had. I can provide it to you, like Doug said. He did a 2-day crash course, and the amount of excitement that he has when he calls me and says, hey, I have a new idea, how would you carry this out, is pretty infectious, and it's been fun to work with. And he's not the only one that I've given the crash course to and has the bug. So it can be fun. It sounds tedious and oftentimes boring, and certainly it can be. But it's also very rewarding. So for part 1 of the new grant system, farriers are going to apply with a cover letter that you get to kind of brag about yourself, short resume, specific aims page, which I'll go over with you guys later on, and a reference page. And then Doug, James, and I will go through all of these applications that we receive, and we'll give you feedback on what we think you could do better or ideas for how you could make this grant better. And on top of that, if you haven't already indicated to us that there's someone in the academic community that you would like to work with, we're going to pair you with somebody in the academic community submits a formal grant application together to the research committee. We organize those applications and we assign 2 academics and 1 Farrier per application to anonymously review each grant application and score them according to a guideline sheet they've been provided with. And the top 2 scored grants will be selected for funding. So we have a say in the first part, helping you guys out. We don't have a say in the second part. That's up to the academic community and the Farrier that is also reviewed. When the project's complete, we ask that you publish in a veterinary journal, in a real scientific journal, and we also want you to present your work in the Farrier form in layman's terms.
Well, I kind of touched on this pretty quickly, but what we discovered when we reached out initially to the veterinarian community and the research community is that they were actually really excited to do research that is related to the foot. They don't have the opportunity to do it without us. They need us to do it. So when we sent out, I don't remember how many emails, 50, 60, 70 in one day. Within the end of 24 hours, there were already 30 or 40 responses with researchers who were chomping at the bit to get hooked up with Farriers and perform this research. So it's there's a demand for it and there's a lack of it in the industry.
So that being said, we did have our grant. Oh, sorry. We did have our grant. We did have our first grant cycle last year, and Travis Burns got it, so congratulations to Travis. If you guys at the end of the talk are interested, October 5th of 2018, the first step application is due. November 2nd, you guys will get your feedback back and get a mentor if you didn't already have one. And January 4th, your second step application with your mentor will be due. So we'll give you a way to get that information later on.
Just really quick, who's thought of ideas? Have any of you thought of stuff in the past that you wanted to put together? 2, 3, 4, come on, give me 5, give me 6, give me 7, come on, let's go. So that's exciting for us, and like I said, it's really exciting for the academics that we have who are interested in doing it. And you'll see by some of the examples we're going to put forward here later in the talk that this research can be really small and simple in scale. It doesn't matter how stupid you might think it could be. There's base data that has to be collected before we can build on that. And so bear with us, don't cloud over. We're going to simplify this so everybody understands it, and then we can go forward as a team. And we have, Katie and I both have several ideas that need to be done that we're looking for people to do a lot of this research on as well.
Also, just like to point out that we just gave a standing ovation to Mike Pvalue for his work that Mark later proved. And Mark was gracious enough to give him the credit for having the idea first. That doesn't always happen in science. Had Mike published his work in a peer-reviewed journal, Mark wouldn't even have a PhD thesis on that. So that's how much we need to get ourselves on the books. So I give my resume as an example of you don't have to necessarily have the letters behind your name in order to produce high-quality research. So this isn't to brag about myself, more to brag about my mentorship. When I was at Boston Children's, I published a paper a year in a peer-reviewed journal. And I was given the freedom to do that, and he taught me the structure and all I needed to do that. And I don't have the letters behind my name. So just as an example of, well, that's just an example of you don't necessarily have to be qualified to do it. In terms of titles, just getting into the world and so that you guys are aware of what some of these terms are. A bachelor's degree is kind of basics in science when you start your career. When you get your bachelor's, you're able to be a research assistant. So I was a research assistant at Boston Children's. From there, you could get a master's or you could not. That's kind of personal preference in your own road. And then you can do from a bachelor's to a PhD or from a master's to a PhD. And then from there, it's pretty linear from PhD, postdoc to professor. So some people in the academic community get caught up in their titles. This is just so you guys have at least been introduced to it. So what is the scientific method? How many of you guys are familiar with what it even is? Any of you? So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, basically you have this idea, and then you need to basically be able to write this idea down or articulate this idea, and then you need to research it. What have other people done about this idea? If they've already ran through the research, how did they do it? Were there flaws in the way that they carried it out? Those are all questions that you're going to start to gather as you get supporting information for your idea. And then once you do that, you can come up with really cool experimental designs that you can do to carry out what you want to prove. And once you get through that stage, you do your experiment and your data collection. And if at any point in time you guys get lost, please just let me know. This is not meant to be intimidating or anything in the least. And if you wanted to take pictures or whatever of the slides, go for it. So after your idea, it really starts with the literature. And oftentimes, if you're reading, you can come up with better ideas. So it goes both ways. You could be reading a bunch of papers and come up with more ideas than you can coming up with ideas and work and then go into the literature search. It doesn't really matter where the idea stems from. I'm going to kind of show you guys how I break down a paper, and I want to stress that this is a skill. I was talking to Travis Burns yesterday about this process, and he was like, well, people that are expecting to just read a scientific paper without any training in it is kind of like a new kid at Farrier school walking up to the professor and say, or the teacher and saying, hey, I want to build a roadster today. It's a skill that you have to practice. So this paper that I've got here, by Kirsty Lesniak, it's in Animals, it's a free paper, so if you wanted to snap a picture of the slide or write down the title, it's a really nice introduction to the literature. It's really well written, and the take-home message is really cool in regards to Farrier. So I referenced this paper throughout the talk a little bit, and this talk was adapted for one of our clinics, so in the clinics you would have the paper, but this is free and you can look it up, so I apologize that you don't have it.
Are you familiar with journal clubs? They're common in colleges or scientific education. So they actually will get together. What do we do? Alex at Iowa State once a week. So they'll get a copy of a peer-reviewed paper. They'll all read it independently, and then they get together and they talk about their perception of the research. Katie and I are going to try to get journal clubs going within the Farrier industry, probably starting at vet schools, or not vet schools, but Farrier schools. But there's a possibility with the internet that we can have those going online as well, probably in the future if people are interested in it.
So to find papers to read, where do you start? You could find a paper on just about any subject that may or may not be valid. The way to get around whether it's valid or not is whether it's peer reviewed. And the way that you tell peer review is if you get articles through either PubMed, which is the first picture there, it's just pubmed.gov, or Google Scholar. PubMed is a little bit more professional. It's a government-run website. Google Scholar is sometimes easier for people to use, but both are good sources to start. And how they work is you just, in the search bar, type in what you want to find. So I'm going to pick on Mark again because I've used his research is actually in this presentation, but trying to prepare for this and find Mark's paper, I typed in his name and then equine hoof, and then his papers pop up. So it's not all that hard to use. So when I read a paper, I don't read it in order. And if I'm familiar with the subject, I hardly ever read the introduction, and I don't ever read the abstract after I've received the paper. So when I'm looking for papers, I read the abstract to make sure that it's what I want, and then I download it and put it into a folder, and then the folders are labeled according to what I'm looking at, the subject I'm looking at. So that's my system. It doesn't necessarily going to make sense for all of you. Everyone develops their own. But that's what I do with an abstract. I only read the introduction if I'm not familiar with the work. So for instance, I've started working at MSU, Michigan State, in the anatomy professor's lab. And she's into equine metabolic syndrome. And I have not a ton of background in the metabolic side of things. So when I read papers for her, I have to read the introduction. But I have a lot of experience with bone and blood because that's what my previous history was in. So if I'm looking up a paper for that, I hardly ever read the introduction for those subjects. Results is really the meat of your paper. So, if anything else, if you want to get started, what I suggest doing is starting with the figures, which are the pictures, and reading the results. And if that's all the brain power you have for the day, awesome. That's a great start. If you only get through a piece of the results, that's great too. You're not going to be able to read a paper start to finish when you start. No one can. Some people that perceive themselves to be really smart might tell you that they do it that way, but when it came down to it, when they started to learn to read, no one just is able to just read a paper. It's a skill set.
Katie was really sensitive with me. We would read part of a paper and she could tell that my leg was getting jittery and I was starting to watch little dust rabbits float by and she would say, okay, you go build a shoe and then come back and we'll finish this paper. So there's necessary breaks in the middle of these.
And then if you come across a word you don't know, it's important to either A, look it up in the moment, or B, highlight it or underline it so you know that you need to go look it up after. Same thing with a concept or anything else that you're not quite sure on. You'll be able to find the information elsewhere. I write all over my papers. I print them out. And if I'm not printing them out, then I have a piece of notebook paper and I'm writing all over the notebook paper. It's an active process.
Quick question. I've had trouble getting to be able to get on sites for veterinary papers or published. And how can we access those a lot of times even if you're not a vet?
Most of the time, if you email the author that has correspondence, they'll give you the paper. When it comes to our grant system, I'm going to try to accommodate as many requests for papers as I can. It's a bit of a tricky situation, and in the future, something that we'd like to get going as this program gets going is maybe the AFA buying into a share of a journal so that we have access to the journal through the AFA. It's down the line, but something to aspire to. So methods is how they did things. So if you find something, a lot of times I would read a paper and the results didn't quite make sense to me, and then I'd go to the methods, and it would either be like, oh, now I get it because they did it this way, or it would be like, oh, I totally disagree with their conclusions based on how they did things. Those are sorts of thoughts that you develop as you continue on reading. And then the last thing, if I read it at all, is the conclusions and discussion. If you read that first, you're kind of cheating because you're just taking what the author said for granted. This is the place where they don't really have to be objective. This is the place where the author gets to state their opinions about their work. And so if you really just want to know what the data they produced is and make your own conclusions, the results is what's really important.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes, you may.
Do you not think in some of the papers, the way that they construct them, the results are just the results, and the way that they then use the discussion to interpret the results against the original introduction, which is the previous, generally a review of the previous work?
Yeah, I think it's important to read, but I think that if you're in a place where you're struggling to get through the whole paper, I'd much rather people read the results and wrap their head around the results themselves than read the author's opinion on the previous work and all that. I think that once you get better at it, that part's important too.
Yeah, but I think my point there really is that depending on how far down you are down any research line, you're not familiar with statistical language
Yeah,
and interpretation of statistics, the results can be a bit overwhelming,
yeah,
whereas the discussion, which is the interpretation of the results, might give you a better clue.
yeah.
But
So
you're
if
still
you're-
going to end up going back to results because you've got to understand the statistics, but you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so to Mark's point, what he's trying to tell everyone is that if you're really struggling with the results, then go to the conclusions, because then you can use the author's point of view to understand what they did for the results.
Yeah.
Does that help everyone out? Cool. So experimental design is really, really hard for me to just tell you, because experimental design comes after you have your hypothesis and you've done your literature review and you're gathering what people have done, how they've done it, tools you can use, and things like that. This is where I referenced that paper I encouraged you guys to pick up. In that paper, they used exterior measures of the foot via photography, and they established a number of horses they wanted to use in the study. And then they spent a lot of time eliminating variables, and then they went about doing their method section. So it's hard for me to teach you guys. It wasn't something that I could leave out of the presentation. This is for experimental design. If you guys are interested in applying to the grant system, this is where you email me and we talk about your idea and we come up with design together. Does anyone have specific questions about design? I know it's hard because you guys don't really have a basis for it either.
Can you comment on the N in relationship to in vivo and in vitro studies? About how hard it is to get a significant power number for...
Sure, yeah, especially with horses. You jumped the gun a little bit, but that's okay. So, in vivo means in the living animal, and in vitro means outside the living animal. So, when you have an in vivo study, oftentimes you're limited by the amount of subjects that you can get because you're working with something that's alive. In vitro, you could kind of do more. It's more dependent on how much money you have rather than how many subjects that you can get. So, in horses, it's particularly difficult to get large N's and in vivo studies because the public has a kind of sentimental attachment to horses. And AWCF, which is the governing body in the United States that regulates animal welfare and research, will literally pick people off the streets to be in AWCF committees. And they're the ones judging if your treatment of animals is quality enough or not in terms of your animal welfare. So that becomes a problem with horses. So getting a high number of in vivo animals can be difficult sometimes. Whereas if you were to use cadaver legs, no one cares how many cadaver legs you use. It's a matter of money at that point. So I'm going to go over components of the grant that we're asking for. And this is largely going to depend on the grant itself. I've applied for a National Institutes of Health grant, and I think I had 20 sections that I had to turn in. We're not asking for that much. The cover letter I went over a little bit. It's just tell us what you intend to do and why you're the person to do it. Resume, it's just like a straightforward everyday resume, page and a half. What's your background, and if you have case studies that are of interest to your study, include those. So specific aims, I'd have like a whole, I keep promising I'll come back to that. But basically what that is concisely tell us how your experiment builds a coherent study. References is your literature search. Background and research strategy is kind of the fun part of the grant. That's where you expand on your specific aims and you tell us how you're going to make everything happen and what the background is that got you there. Budget's pretty straightforward. How much is it going to cost you to complete the work and how much money are you asking of us? And mentor versus Farrier responsibilities. This is a teaching grant. We want to know that your mentor isn't just going to carry out all the work for you. We need to know what you're going to do to be involved in the project. Animal welfare. We want to see a plan for your use of animals, and if you're through an institution, your team is expected to file an AFA protocol if it's necessary. Facilities and resources. What tools and resources and facilities do you have to be able to carry out the work? How big is your shop space? How many forges and anvils and and hammers do you have that are necessary to carry out the work?
Another question.
Yeah.
What are the qualifications for your people?
I'd probably say it's going to be easiest if you pair with somebody that's at an institution, but I haven't ruled out if you wanted to work with a vet that has some research experience. Yes, Mark?
Do you expect it to have applied for ethical approval before you apply for the grant?
No. I think what I've been advised by a bunch of different veterinarians that are involved with lab animal research is that we ask questions that I'll go over later in the presentation to make sure that people are thinking about the process. And then we require that if you need an adequate protocol, that you fill one out. And then plans to share research. Again, I'm going to bring up Mike Pvalue. He didn't publish it. It wasn't peer reviewed, and he missed out on that. So, specific aims page, really important. It's the only section that I have 2 slides devoted to. So, I was fortunate to work for a guy at Michigan State who was really, really good at getting grant money in a time where grant money was hard to come by. In his first year at Michigan State, he brought in $5 million, which was such a big deal to the community that he was on the local news. And so what I learned from him with that is that a lot of the times, and this isn't going to be the case for us, but it's good for you guys to think about, he'll have a stack and study section of applications about this high. He's not going to read all of that. What he's going to read is your specific aims page. He wants to know concisely how you're going to do stuff, why you want to do stuff, and how you're going to carry it out. So kind of the rules he gave me was you have to include enough background to show the impact to the industry and to allow the reviewer to understand your study, but you can't write a novel about it because it's just a page. And then each aim is made up of 2 to 4 experiments that answer an overarching hypothesis or idea for that aim. And that aim hypothesis must help answer the question for the study overall. And then each aim must be independent from the other. You can't have to complete aim 1 to complete aim 2. Because if something goes wrong with aim 1, we as a funding body don't want to give you money that you've said you can do aim 2 and it turns out you can't. And we at least want you to be able to complete some of the aims. So that being said, this is something that I wrote as an example, and this is how he had us formatted. This is where the formatting even becomes important. So the bold and underline was to say, this is what we want to do. So to elucidate the role that heat plays in killing microbes on the solar surface of the flip capsule. That's what we want to do. And then heat has been shown to be an effective way to kill many microbes. I have references for that, so I've noted them there. Until now, there's been no work elucidating these claims when it comes to hot shoeing and equine foot. In other words, nobody's written anything about this. We've been saying it for years, but no one's proven it's true. So what we want to do, a sterile swab will be used to take a sample before trim, and after hot shoeing on the left foot, on the left hoof on the solar surface of the foot compared to a cold shod foot on the contralateral limb. So that's how we want to carry it out. And then the overall hypothesis for this aim is that we hypothesize that the effect of hot shoeing will be to kill microbes on the solar surface of the foot where the shoe is applied. So most of you guys told us that you weren't researchers. Mark obviously is an exception to the rule. And this should be pretty easy for you guys to understand, right? You know what I want to do. So it doesn't have to be fancy, elegant, complex in any stretch of the imagination. And this goes back to what Doug was saying, that these studies don't have to be earth-shattering. We have to start writing down what we've been telling people happens. And we have to prove that it does actually happen. So references, I have never handwritten a reference since grade school. I found this website, EasyBib, when I was in junior high, and it's been the best thing ever. I just, sorry, wrong button. make sure that it's in the format that I want. And then I go down here to journal, and I type in the journal name, and I find my article, and it does it for me, and then I copy and paste that to my Word document. So this website, easybiv.com, is the way to go for references, in my opinion. So your background and your research strategy, again, this is more the fun part. Literally what I do is I take my specific aims page, copy the whole thing, paste it into a new document, and I expand on all the things that I've talked about in the specific aims. Exactly how I'm going to do things, what equipment I'm going to use, any preliminary data that I've already gathered, alternative methods if my research doesn't go the way that I've planned. And you generally give a little bit of background with this as well. And you have to really be sure that you relay the impact of the study on the farrier industry in this case. We want to know that what you're doing is going to impact our industry. So now we're to the animal welfare slides. I've gone over this a little bit now, but the questions that Mark was asking about, these are the 4 questions that most AFA committees and institutions will ask you to address in an application. And they're important. We definitely owe it to the animals to go through this process and think about these things. So, is the procedure expected to cause more than momentary pain or distress? What's the plan of action if an animal gets injured in the course of the procedure? What other adverse events could occur in the process of your research? Who's your responsible vet? And are they on call or on site when you're doing the research? And lastly, if you're going to have anything that causes pain or discomfort, how are you going to alleviate it to the best of your ability?
None of this applies to a rasp to the belly. That's outside of that realm, which at Iowa State we call that impact dermatitis. It typically will go away in 2 to 3 days.
That's because you're using the course sign method.
I haven't perfected my technique, but I'm working on it.
So this is just a slide about IACUC, a little bit more information about it. You guys, if you're further interested in how they handle animal welfare, they have a whole website and they describe the whole process to you. So the fun part is actually carrying out the science. That means you probably got money, which is good. A lot of people think when they do science that you just carry out your experiment, you collect and you organize your data and you run statistics. I'll be the first one to tell you that's not the case. There's an awful lot of troubleshooting that goes along before you get to collect and organize your data. Almost every experiment I've run the first time hasn't worked. And I have to go back and figure out why it hasn't worked. And if it gets to the point where I can't figure out why it didn't work, I have to go to my alternative method. So I have literally spent months in this little circle, around and around and around. And this is where being stubborn comes into play. And you just carry on until you get it. But once you do get it, it's a happy moment, and you collect and you organize your data, and then you can run statistics. So I grabbed this from one of Mark's papers, the graph on the side. And this is going to be an oversimplified view of statistics, but I know a lot of you have heard of a p-value. Mark used significant quite a bit in his presentation, and I found that a lot of people have no idea what that means. So the oversimplified explanation is, first of all, median and average are the same word, and average is in the middle of what's called this bell curve. So whenever you sample a population in anything, it doesn't have to be farrier, it doesn't have to be humans, it doesn't have to be horses, anything. If you sample enough, you're going to get this bell curve. And so a p-value is, science as a whole has decided that p is less than or equal to 0.05, means that it's significant. And what that is on the tails here, this red line right here, and this line right here, that's our p-value. So anything that's on this side and anything that's on this side of that p-value, because this is the positive side and this is the negative side, that means that some people are statistically significantly different from most people, which are in the middle. So that's what that p-value says. And the reason running that is important is I like this graph in particular. This is just, he took some measurements before and after the trim. And you can correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Mark. And looking at this graph, to me, with the naked eye, before and after trim, so before trim is the black line and after the trim is the gray line. They don't really look all that different within each other to me in either category. But he's found, after he's run statistics, that the HB-core/SL measurement that he took is statistically significantly different pre versus post. Whereas in the other categories, they didn't come out to be significant, meaning that they remained and most people win. Did I lose everybody there? We good? Questions? Did I do okay, Mark? Not paying attention.
Could I ask you, I was told the p-value, the way to look at it is, what are the chances that this could have occurred by chance? This is the amount of possibility that this result could have occurred randomly.
Depends on the question you're asking. That's why I personally don't do statistics. When I have data, I send it out to one of my friends that are much more adept at it than I am. And the reason for that is statistics is something that if you're not doing it every single day, it's really hard to wrap your head around. And
It's a double-sided question.
yeah.
And that's the problem with it. All the P numbers do is telling you that that 95% of the population of your answer fall within that medium bell curve. But there is a difference for the other percentage, okay? Or there's a guarantee that there is a difference between this population and that population. It doesn't say that is a significant difference. It just says that it is a guarantee that there is a difference. And then it's up to you to interpret the relevance of that P in relationship to your original hypothesis. So the more you test it, you can end up in a situation where, whilst it looks like there's a difference, that may not be significant, or you can't tell whether it is or whether it isn't, depending on the way that your hypothesis asks the question. So,
It becomes,
I just want to pick up one point you made earlier about experimental design. When you're designing your experiment, you want to keep the statistical analysis as simple as possible, and you want to have talked to a statistician about how you phrase the question, because you could end up asking it the wrong way around, and you think you're getting a positive difference, and when actually you're not. It's telling you that there is significantly no chance of a difference. Yeah? So just make sure you get the questions the right way around.
if any of you guys are interested in attending our clinics, I actually have a statistician come, and he does a talk about it. So and he was pretty good, I think. I hadn't really given Doug the statistics talk at all, and you picked up quite a bit.
There's a really great book out there, Stats for Dummies, and it's perfect for what we do.
So data collection is, again, it's kind of like experimental design. It's going to depend on what your experimental design was as to like how you collect data. These are some kind of notes that I thought were pretty helpful as I've kind of gone on my own journey. And the first one is collect data when you do any experiment, whether it's to troubleshoot the actual experiment or whatever, like it's going to be in a published figure, because you never know what a reviewer is going to ask you for. And they might ask you for how you validated your experiment. And you don't want to have to repeat it in a time crunch to make it pretty. And then be as consistent as you possibly can for each repeat of an experiment, because repeatability is really important. I know I just said you don't want to have to repeat it for pretty. You do want to, however, be able to repeat it at your leisure to be able to prove that you can repeat it. And that's actually been a huge issue in academic research, and industry has called academic research out on that a lot recently because they have read academic papers and tried to do something to build on it for industry and haven't been able to repeat it. So there's a lot to say on that subject, but it's kind of over the scope of the talk. So peer review. In my opinion, this is the most important piece. My mentor at Boston Children's used to tell me that it's not your idea until you have it published. And I got scooped a couple of times, meaning that somebody else published the work I was working on before I did. And it sucks, but he's absolutely right. It's not my idea until it's written in paper. And that's something to keep in mind. And that's part of the respect that we get doing the research ourselves. So peer review tries to remove bias from science. Normally, if you have something that you're working on and you want a different opinion, you're going to share it with one of your friends. Chances are your friends are like-minded, so they're not going to see holes in it that you didn't see in it because they're like-minded. What peer review does is force you to step outside that box and share it with people who might not be like-minded that can, well, basically poke holes in your work. And then they allow you to see those critiques, and then you can address them, and then you can send them back. So typically, you send a paper back to a publisher 2 or 3 times before it's actually accepted. Anyone have questions on peer review?
I want to add really quick, because I hit on briefly our standing professionally. Working at the university has been eye-opening to me. And to give you an example, I've been stuck twice now in a battle between veterinarians over specific cases that included me. And it wasn't, the arguments didn't consist of, well, I had done this on this horse and it worked once. The arguments went back and forth, quoting references, dates, times, papers, peer-reviewed papers. That's what they argue with. That's how they rationalize the procedure that they use. And that's part of the reason that we're lagging behind as an industry, is because we come together every year and we do talks and say, I had this horse that had this problem with this foot, I put this shoe on it and it worked, therefore let's use this shoe. There's no peer-reviewed process, there's no scientific process to proving that that works, which is why everything or most things that we like to present as truth is purely anecdotal. Yeah, and that's where we're missing the boat right there. And it's not that those things aren't working. I think a lot of the stuff that we've used, tried and true, we know it works, and so we have to simply conform to this process and prove it to our counterparts in order to be accepted at that level. Does that make sense? Shake your heads. All right, so this is just a really simple idea that I had. How do I switch this? All right, I'm not allowed to touch the computer. 2017, Iowa had one of the worst droughts on record. I guess I've only been there 3 years, but evidently it was an awful drought, 0 rain. I thought that I noticed a huge increase of abscesses coming into the hospital this particular summer, more so than the last 2 summers that I saw prior to 2017. So it's, wow, you're slick that quicker. One advantage that I have at the hospital is that we keep electronic medical records. I do. For every horse that I touch has an electronic medical record. I can go into the system, put in keywords like abscess, and I can search from specific date to specific date, and I can see every horse that came into the hospital that was treated for an abscess during that time. So my work's not done there. At that point, I have to look at which ones were not associated with puncture wounds. So I have to look at abscesses that, in other words, just kind of happened. The owner went out to feed hay that afternoon and the horse was 3-legged lame. We brought it up to Iowa State and we drained an abscess. We didn't find a puncture wound or a nail. There wasn't anything, there wasn't a coffin bone sequester or something else that caused that. So we might be able to assume that it's environmental, or stomped his foot or caught a rock or one of those things. So I had to narrow it down to that. and I don't remember my total numbers, but 2017, you can see when I compared that from April to October in 16 and 15, that we did have almost twice as many abscesses. So I wasn't crazy. I was maybe onto something. And then the next thing we have to do, you know, this is, I guess, Katie's way of proving that I am crazy, because these are things that we see, things that correlate together. For instance, the divorce rate per capita and the consumption of margarine. So this is where evaluating that data is coming in handy. This is a very good one too, skiing facilities. Here's our third one. Sour cream is dangerous. I think a lot of people don't realize the risks involved with sour cream. But anyway, back to what I'm looking at here. Yeah. So simply going back online. No, go back to that first one. No, the other way. One more. Keep going. Yeah, that one. Okay, so I was able to go on to Iowa State University's precipitation report and look at our average rainfalls for 2015, 16, and 17. I had to narrow that down between those months that I was also looking at the spike we had in abscesses. And it did happen to correspond with roughly half of the rainfall that we had received in average years before that. So based on observation, I could make this hypothesis that rapid changes in moisture content or in environment, drought conditions, could lead to an increase of abscesses. Simply put, I had an idea and I think I might be right. Do I have enough data right now? No, I'm not even close. So this would what we'd be calling retrospective data collection. So I've looked backwards for the last 3 years. I've collected a small amount of data that has indicated to me that it might be worth pursuing this idea, that I might be able to get enough data put together going forward to prove this idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how would you guys go about it?
We collect
Look
data
at
in
different
other
parts of the
areas.
country with,
Yeah, some of
There's not a wrong answer here.
Yeah, collect similar data from other areas that were affected by droughts.
Exactly. Did everybody hear that?
Desert areas.
Did you happen to notice a difference between these horses that were abscessing? How many was barefoot compared to shod?
No. So there's another piece of the puzzle that we would have to add to this equation.
Were
Barefoot
there
versus
just
shod.
more horses in the area?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is just the numbers of horses.
Yeah.
Just because you saw more doesn't mean there were more per capita or more percentage.
Did everybody hear that? Possibly there was just an increase in horse population in Iowa that year.
Yeah.
So this is the point I'm making, is that I thought maybe I put together some convincing data right there, but that's a small piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And so then we have to go about the process like Katie had talked about, troubleshooting. We have to figure out those questions like you've asked. Barefoot versus shod. More horses that were, the influx of horses into the community that particular year. And then, like this young lady over here had mentioned, looking at different regions. That would be important to do. And when collecting this kind of data, one of the first places you can go are universities or large animal hospitals, because they'll keep those electronic medical records. And if you can make friends with somebody there, you can probably get an intern or a resident to go through and look up those numbers for you to help you collect your data. I'm going to let Katie take over this. Does everybody remember the survey? I think the most, the most significant, I'm not allowed to say that, but what was significant to me about this was that we handed out over 500 surveys and we got 90 back. So that would indicate only 18% filled out surveys. So over 75% of farriers cannot follow directions. That would be my conclusion. But there was a purpose for the survey, and actually we did get a good turnout on it. And this is just another small example of how we can put this data together and go forward. And as we get into it, I want to give special recognition to Gerard Laverty, because this was an idea that he had, something that we should begin to look at, and this was the beginning process of that, of Gerard's idea.
So these are really simple level things. I basically just took percentages. We didn't actually do real statistics on the data because last night I was not in any position to really try. So of the 90 that had filled them out, 77% of them had done an apprenticeship. And I was pretty impressed by that number, actually. I thought it was going to be much lower. So it's nice to be surprised by your data. And that's kind of actually another point I want to make. A lot of people that do science, they'll have an idea and they're set that this idea is going to be what happens. You have to be open-minded about science. It'll lead you in different directions, and sometimes the best discoveries are the ones that you didn't anticipate.
So on the results that you got, is there a possibility that people self-selected and only those that did apprenticeships answered the survey?
That's absolutely possible. Yeah, because it was easier. We tried to make the questionnaire like not super intimidating, but yeah, I mean probably the people that put more effort into certification wanted to say something about it, and that goes to psychology of surveys, which is more epidemiology related than I have experience.
So there was questions included in that survey that we had no interest of the answer of. So it's basically intended to mislead the person filling out that survey and hopefully get an answer, an honest answer on the few questions that we were most interested in. This is like we were saying before, a small sampling, and then this survey would have to be, you know, perpetuated and pushed on. Yeah, far beyond what we've collected here.
Right.
When was this survey passed out, by the way?
It was at the registration desk.
At the registration.
They didn't do a
office.
very
See
good
it.
job of letting you know it was there.
All right.
I saw it sitting on the.
See, there's another
I
guy.
never even saw it.
Box right there, the left of the finish.
So out of the 77% that did an apprenticeship, 75% of those achieved some level of certification at the time of their apprenticeship, which again is pretty encouraging, I thought. It means that, well, in my mind, it means that apprenticeship is pushing people to be better. Obviously, need more data to prove that, as we said over and over again. So this is another set of hypotheses that we generated just playing with those numbers. It seems as though the AFA is a networking tool to get people into apprenticeships. The amount of certification increases with apprenticeships, and those certifications benefit the farrier industry as a whole. And I've written those as statements, but they're really questions. And each one of those could potentially be an aim if you wanted to do a grant about this subject.
I think it was encouraging. I mean, and what we saw like on individual surveys is that many of the apprentices went on to go on to higher certifications than the farriers, than their mentor farriers. This is through the AFA. I think this is a good pat on the back for our association. And this goes back to Gerard's idea last year, when we're looking for these simple ideas and how we can accredit the AFA in our certification here, is looking at the possibility. We'd have to send these surveys out and get into animal hospitals and referral centers around the U.S., Canada, and the world, possibly. But the number of horses coming in that are lame, can we establish who's treating those horses? Can we somehow establish that certified journeyman farriers keep horses sounder than people who are not certified, or certified farriers for that matter? If we can establish this as a truth, then this is something to sell to insurance companies. Lots of horses that come into Iowa State are insured. If those owners' insurance premiums were going to be lower if they employed an AFA certified farrier, there would be lots of horse owners that were going, who is the AFA? And I want one of those farriers. So This is a small way that these research projects can benefit our association specifically and our industry. What do you think? Any thoughts?
I think those thoughts should be probably laid out with those surveys. A lot of people don't fill a survey out just because they think it's a waste of time. I filled that survey out, and I thought it was a waste of time.
Do you still think it's a waste
No,
of
I do
time?
not.
All right.
Now I
so-
have the accurate information.
Yeah.
So if
But
the information's been
would we get an
incorrect-
honest answer if you knew what we were looking for in the survey? That's the problem.
Yeah.
You would, I don't know. if
You'd
we would.
inherit a bias. So
Yeah.
you have to kind of play tricks on people
Yeah.
to try to remove as much bias as you can. And that goes back to eliminating variables.
I think in your premise is a great idea, but for instance, it's also possible that people that send horses to those places use expensive horses and work them hard, and that you may actually not see that correlation. In other words, you could take really good care of them, but if they're horses that are used hard and go to the universities, you might see that there's a lot of them.
That's true, and I in no way want to claim that as that was Gerard's idea.
Right, just as a thought.
Especially.
He liked it for a minute.
You remember that?
There's an expression that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. So in your all's ideology of tricking people into filling these things out, which maybe you didn't try to trick them, but you put a lot of questions in there that you didn't really care about necessarily. If they were handed out in the little things that everybody was given, and then you said, and whoever turns this in, their number or name's gonna go on a raffle, well now see, even these people that didn't think it benefited them now, oh, well, heck, a raffle.
Farriers are like sluts for shiny things. Yeah, I mean, everybody, we would have had 500 surveys for sure.
That's
Yeah.
good feedback for the next one.
in this trade,
Yes, yeah, absolutely not.
So I think we're out of time, but if you guys have questions, seriously, this email address, it goes to me or to just contact us, and we're really just here to help you. We want to give you the tools that you need to get these questions answered, and we want to empower farriers to be able to do it. You don't have to have a degree to do it. You don't have to be some level of qualified to do it. You just need to be given the tools you need to carry it out, and that's what we're here for.